They never meant for you to hear his name spoken this way. In the first hours before dawn, while the world still believed itself safe, a man the system called property decided history would bleed. What followed terrified an entire civilization, not because of the deaths, but because of what those deaths proved. Listen carefully. Once you understand why they feared him, you will never see power the same way again. America tells this story like a warning label. A madman, fanatic, a monster who erupted from nowhere. But that framing is deliberate, because the truth is far more dangerous. Nat Turner was not chaos. He was clarity. He was what happens when a control system fails so completely that the mind inside it stops asking for permission to breathe. To understand why the South trembled at his name, you must first understand the machine he was born into. Slavery was not just forced labor. It was a psychological architecture designed to crush identity, fracture memory, and replace selfhood with obedience. Every law, every sermon, every patrol existed to answer one question. How do you keep millions of men from realizing they outnumber their masters? Fear was the currency. Division was the strategy. Religion was weaponized not to free the soul but to pacify it. Enslaved men were taught that suffering was divine order, that rebellion was sin, that obedience was salvation. This was not accidental. It was one of the earliest large-scale experiments in institutional psychological control in American history. And then Nat Turner appeared literate, articulate, inwardly unbroken. That alone made him dangerous. He could read the same Bible used to chain him and extract a completely different message. Where they preached submission, he saw judgment. Where they demanded patience, he saw reckoning. This is where the story stops being about race and starts being about power. Because systems do not fear violence nearly as much as they fear meaning. Violence can be punished. Meaning spreads. Turner did not simply reject his chains. He rejected the mental framework that justified them. He believed rightly or wrongly that history itself had selected him as an instrument. And once a man believes that his actions are sanctioned by something higher than law, the entire architecture of control begins to crack. That is why Virginia buried this story under euphemisms. That is why textbooks softened it into an incident. That is why testimonies were sealed, names erased, consequences reframed. Not to protect the dead, but to protect the living from realizing how fragile the system really was. Because Nat Turner was not an anomaly. He was a signal, and signals are contagious. Nat Turner was born into a world that spoke in contradictions and enforced them with violence. A nation announcing liberty while perfecting bondage. A faith preaching love while sanctifying ownership. From his first breath, Turner was submerged in a system designed to convince him that his thoughts were not his own. Yet something inside him refused to close. He learned to read not because the system wanted him educated, but because it underestimated the consequences. Literacy was supposed to make him useful. Instead, it made him aware. Awareness is the first fracture in any control structure. Once a man can read the rules, he can also read the lies between them. The Bible was meant to be a tranquilizer. Passages were selected carefully, sermons edited with surgical precision. Obey your masters. Turn the other cheek. Suffer now, be rewarded later. But Turner read the entire text. He read the parts they never preached. Plagues, Exodus, judgment, kings struck down by divine decree. He did not see himself as cursed. He saw himself as positioned. This is where historians grow uncomfortable and institutions grow silent. Turner claimed visions, voices, signs written in the sky. Modern minds rush to dismiss this as delusion, but that reaction reveals a misunderstanding of power. Throughout history, every system-shaking figure, religious, political, revolutionary, has anchored his resolve in something transcendent. Call it God, call it destiny, call it psychological certainty. The effect is the same. A man who believes his actions are inevitable cannot be negotiated with. Turner's visions did something far more threatening than inspire him. They gave him immunity to fear. Fear is the primary enforcement mechanism of slavery. Fear of pain, fear of separation, fear of death. But Turner had already crossed the mental boundary where death was preferable to submission. Once a man reaches that threshold, chains become symbolic. And the system sensed it. Slaveholders often described Turner as peculiar, serious, unsettling. These are the words used when power feels itself slipping but cannot yet name the threat. They saw intelligence without deference, conviction without permission, a mind that did not bend. When Turner ran away and then returned, the system misread it as submission. In reality, it was reconnaissance. He had tasted the edges of freedom and understood the terrain of pursuit. He had learned how far fear traveled and where it weakened. Returning was not surrender. It was patience. Patience is often mistaken for compliance. Tyrannies make this mistake repeatedly and pay for it in blood. Turner was not gathering weapons yet. He was gathering certainty, watching, listening, measuring men, learning who still believed the lie and who only pretended to. He understood something most revolutions fail to grasp. Action without psychological alignment collapses. Belief must come first. By the time the signs appeared in the sky eclipses, strange light, disruptions, even the masters whispered about Turner no longer asked whether rebellion was justified. He believed it was required. And when belief becomes obligation, history starts to move. August 1831 arrived with a heat that seemed almost deliberate, as if the sun itself pressed down on Southampton County to warn the complacent. The air was thick with humidity, the swamps exhaled their damp decay, and the forests whispered in ways only those willing to listen could hear. Nat Turner had waited for this moment his entire life, though he would not yet call it the rebellion. To him, it was prophecy unfolding, a divine calculus written in sweat, blood, and shadow. He gathered his trusted few in the dense woods near Cabin Pond, far from prying eyes. Men chosen not for loyalty to a man, but for alignment to a vision. Park called Hercules for his strength. Henry, steady and unflinching. Nelson, careful, calculating. Sam, familiar with the surrounding farms. Each man understood the cost. Each man had nothing left to lose that the system hadn't already taken. And Nat? He had lived his entire existence in preparation for this, absorbing both injustice and spiritual signs until the world itself seemed to obey him. The plan was simple in its horror and precision. Move from farm to farm, take the houses by surprise, eliminate those who would maintain the chains over the living. Gather arms. Recruit others. Expand. By the time dawn arrived on August 22nd, Turner's small army, 8 men at first, became a machine of retribution. Every step was deliberate. Every choice was strategic. There was no cruelty for its own sake. There was only purpose. And purpose, in the hands of the oppressed, is terrifying. They struck first at the Travis household, moving silently through the darkness. The weight of what they were about to do could have shattered any man. Yet Turner moved like a force outside time, executing the beginning of a war that had already been centuries in preparation. Every act of violence was not only physical but symbolic. Every death was a crack in the narrative of submission, an eruption of suppressed truth the masters refused to acknowledge. And here lies the part of the story most textbooks obscure. Turner's rebellion was not indiscriminate. His own family, enslaved nearby, remained untouched. This was not the action of a man driven solely by vengeance. It was a calculated measure of war, a strategic restraint that emphasized the intelligence behind his fury. The rebellion was an idea manifested in flesh, a statement that one mind, fully awake and unbound, could defy entire institutions. As the morning light crept across the tobacco fields, Turner drilled his men in formations, preparing them not as slaves, but as soldiers. Other enslaved men joined them, drawn by something older than fear, something deeper than hope. By mid-morning, the rebellion's numbers swelled. Yet the momentum was not blind. Each step was choreographed, each kill measured against the certainty that freedom, however distant, demanded sacrifice. And as they moved from house to house, the true terror of the rebellion revealed itself not just in death, but in awareness. Every planter who looked upon the approaching shadow of Turner felt instinctively that the world they knew could collapse in an instant. Because it could. The math was simple. Power is fragile. One fully awakened mind, and its consequences ripple faster than any army. The system had created Nat Turner. But in the fields, in the forests, in the still, suffocating heat of that August morning, he began to unmake it. By noon, Turner's rebellion had grown in size and intensity, and with each passing hour, the fragile illusion of control that had gripped Southampton County for generations began to crumble. His men, now numbering around 60, moved with the precision of those who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Every house they approached was a test not only of courage, but of the system's vulnerability. The violence was methodical, terrifying, and unavoidable. And for the first time, the white population realized that their laws, their guns, and their threats were not shields but illusions. The Whitehead farm would become the epicenter of this realization. Catherine Whitehead, her elderly mother, her grown son, 4 daughters, and a grandchild all believed themselves secure behind the thin walls of a home they thought inviolable. Turner approached not as a wild man, but as a strategist, a conductor orchestrating the collapse of centuries of mental and physical control. In this space, terror became a weapon sharper than any blade, a language that communicated the fragility of authority in ways words never could. Nat Turner personally delivered the fatal strike to Catherine Whitehead. It was the only life he claimed with his own hands during the rebellion, and even that act is shadowed in ambiguity. The men around him executed his will, yet Turner understood that leadership is not the absence of restraint, but the disciplined application of power. His restraint with the innocent, or, in his view, the strategically unnecessary, reveals the complexity of a man who was at once prophet, general, and executioner. And still, the rebellion was more than acts of violence. It was a psychological shockwave. The enslaved men who joined Turner did so not because they understood every detail, but because they recognized the potency of belief embodied in action. One awakened mind can awaken others. One deliberate act of defiance can shatter illusions long held sacred. Each farm that fell was not only a tactical victory, it was a message written in blood and fear, a declaration that the social contract of oppression was negotiable, if only one had the courage to challenge it. By mid-afternoon, Turner's group split strategically, each faction moving to maximize impact. Hark took a contingent toward Henry Bryan's property, while Turner led others to Catherine Whitehead's home. The growing rebellion was not random. It was a lesson in the art of terror, a demonstration that knowledge of geography, psychology, and timing could amplify even a small force against a dominant system. And yet, Turner's vision extended beyond mere survival. He believed that each act was part of a divine plan, a fulfillment of the prophecies that had guided him for decades. The solar eclipses, the unusual colors of the sun, the uncanny timing of events, they were not coincidences, but signals. And he responded to them with an exactitude that terrified those who tried to rationalize him. At this point, the rebellion had transcended its physical manifestation. It was a mental contagion. Fear was spreading faster than bodies, and the white population realized that their confidence was built on paper promises, idle threats, and centuries of psychological conditioning now failing before their eyes. Nat Turner had not only led a revolt, he had revealed a fundamental truth. A system that enslaves minds ultimately enslaves itself. This is where the first lesson becomes clear. Control is never absolute. It is fragile. And once someone awakens fully, with clarity and conviction, the structures built to suppress them can collapse in hours, or even minutes. That day in Southampton, they began to collapse. Halfway through the script, you would ask viewers to comment, "I see the truth. twice to solidify engagement and transformation. The mind that participates is the mind that awakens. By late afternoon, the rebellion had become more than an event, it had become a phenomenon, a disruption of reality itself for those who believed the social order immutable. Men who had lived in certainty now trembled in suspicion. Families barricaded themselves in homes that had once felt inviolable. Even the landscape seemed complicit in Turner's design. The swamps, forests, and backroads created corridors of power for those who knew how to move unseen. Turner had learned every nuance of this terrain, every shadow and creek, every path that could be exploited to his advantage. This was not mere rebellion, it was war choreographed in intimate knowledge of both human and geographic vulnerability. Every act, every strike, every calculated pause served a dual purpose: survival and messaging. The rebellion was not simply a vendetta. It was a demonstration of what happens when a system relies on fear and obedience to maintain authority, and those under its control awaken with clarity. The militia, the sheriffs, the slaveholders, they were armed, yes, but ill-prepared for an enemy that understood their fear, their assumptions, their blind spots. Nat Turner had weaponized understanding, and understanding is a sharper tool than any musket or axe. As the sun began its descent, Turner led his men toward Jerusalem, the county seat, aiming to seize the armory. This was the ultimate escalation, a move from tactical strikes to strategic dominance. The armory symbolized more than weapons. It symbolized access to power, to the means by which the system protected itself. By taking it, Turner would not only gain firepower, he would seize the narrative. He would force the institution to recognize that the people it considered property could think, plan, and act in ways that challenged authority fundamentally. In those hours, Turner's vision began to crystallize. He understood that rebellion is never just physical, it is psychological. The panic he spread, the stories that would ripple through the county, the fear embedded in every letter and diary, these were all part of his strategy. History, he knew, was written not only by what is done, but by what others believe has been done. Every terrified whisper of enslavers and neighbors amplified the reach of the rebellion far beyond its physical confines. And yet, Turner exercised restraint in ways that confound conventional narratives. His own family, nearby, remained untouched. The calculus was deliberate. This was not mindless rage. It was leadership tempered by discipline. He understood that chaos without direction erodes the soul, even of those it intends to empower. By maintaining focus, he made the rebellion not an eruption, but a lesson. That deliberate, conscious action can break cycles of oppression in ways that blind violence cannot. It is in this crucible of violence and clarity that the true lesson emerges. Systems are vulnerable not because they lack force, but because they rely on the obedience of minds. Once belief shifts, even slightly, the edifice begins to crack. Turner's rebellion was not only a revolt of flesh and blood, it was a revolt of consciousness, and consciousness, once awakened, cannot be easily restrained. And so the men pressed on, moving through farms, forests, and the terrified whispers of a population that had never before seen fear embodied with precision and purpose. By nightfall, the narrative was no longer about what had been taken, it was about who had dared to take it, and what that daring revealed about the fragility of control. Here, pause to remind viewers. Comment twice below, I see the truth, to lock in the awareness that what you are witnessing is not history alone, it is a lens through which power itself can be examined, understood, and questioned. Night fell over Southampton County, but the rebellion did not pause. Darkness became Turner's ally. The shadows of forests and swamps, which had long been silent witnesses to oppression, now concealed the unstoppable force of men who understood the value of timing, patience, and absolute resolve. By now, their numbers had swelled as other enslaved men joined, not out of blind obedience, but because they recognized an opportunity to reclaim agency that had been stolen for generations. Turner was no longer a man leading a small strike. He was a signal, a spark igniting minds that had been dulled by centuries of fear. The rebels moved from house to house, calculating speed against thoroughness. Each action was a demonstration that the supposed invincibility of the plantation system was a myth. Enslavers had weapons, yes, but the men acting under Turner's direction had something far more dangerous: certainty. Every swing of an axe, every step through the night, was informed by vision, conviction, and the understanding that once fear is awakened, it spreads faster than any army can march. By this point, the rebellion had become almost surreal in its execution. Nat Turner drilled his men in formations in open fields, practiced maneuvers reminiscent of the militias he had observed, and maintained discipline while chaos unfolded around them. The contrast was striking. Chaos and order, terror and precision, all existing in a single unstoppable force. The system that had taught submission was now being taught fear, and it was learning too late how fragile control really is. The psychological dimension of the rebellion cannot be overstated. Every house overtaken, every planter confronted with mortality, every child or widow removed from comfort and security, it was not simply violence. It was communication. Turner was teaching a lesson that the white population could not unsee. Property can think. Chains can resist. Minds can act. And when those minds awaken simultaneously, the very foundations of an empire tremble. Even as the rebellion unfolded, Turner maintained a clarity that bordered on the otherworldly. He did not act from rage or impulse. He acted from strategy and conviction. He passed his own family in the fields not out of cowardice, but because to bring them into the fight would compromise the operation, would dilute the focus of the men who had committed themselves to this vision. Leadership demanded sacrifice, not sentimentality. He was willing to take lives, endure deaths, and risk annihilation because he understood that some truths once recognized cannot be ignored, even by the most entrenched power structures. By the night of August 22nd, the rebels had killed dozens, armed themselves, and established a presence that terrified the surrounding communities. Yet Turner's vision extended beyond the immediate tally of destruction. He saw the broader truth. Fear, once awakened, is contagious. Authority, once doubted, can never fully return. The rebellion was not just about freedom, it was about consciousness itself, about demonstrating that even the most meticulously controlled society can fracture if minds awaken simultaneously. And in this moment, as the rebels regrouped and strategized under the moonlit sky, the truth became unavoidable. History itself can pivot in hours, and the men who recognize opportunity and act with precision can become forces more powerful than armies, more terrifying than laws, and more enduring than fear. Would you like me to continue to Section 7 with the rebellion's escalation toward Jerusalem and the final hours of the uprising? The dawn of August 23rd brought no relief, only a heavier weight of inevitability. Turner and his men pressed onward, riding and marching through Southampton County like shadows made flesh. Each farm they approached represented more than bodies, it represented the illusion of control, a system maintained for generations by fear, indoctrination, and complacency. With each act of violence, Turner shattered not just lives but the psychological scaffolding that had kept an entire population submissive. The rebellion became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of power to those who thought themselves untouchable. Jerusalem, the county seat, was the symbolic heart of the system. Its courthouse, its churches, its gathering halls represented the laws, religion, and order that had justified bondage for centuries. Turner understood that to strike here was not just to seize arms or kill the occasional overseer, it was to project an idea. That a single awakened mind, with clarity and conviction, could challenge institutions that claimed divine or legal sanction. He did not rush. Every movement was calculated. Each man knew his role, and each knew that hesitation could undo the fragile balance between survival and annihilation. As the rebellion moved closer to Jerusalem, militia forces began to respond, but their panic revealed a system unaccustomed to calculated defiance. Shots rang out, orders were shouted, yet the rebels moved with a purpose that disbelief could not deter. The men who had once been property now dictated terms of engagement. Turner's sword, the symbol he carried from the first farm, became a visual anchor for both fear and authority. The entire county was learning a new truth. Power belongs, ultimately, to those willing to claim it, regardless of precedent or legality. Yet Turner's campaign was not indiscriminate rage. It was precise, disciplined, and conscious of its own limits. He avoided unnecessary distractions, spared those who did not threaten his purpose, and maintained a psychological dominance over his men that ensured cohesion in a chaos others could not control. This combination of strategy and ideology, the mix of intellect, vision, and execution, was what made Turner not merely a rebel, but a symbol of what happens when an oppressed consciousness awakens fully. By the time night fell, Turner's forces had inflicted devastation across the county. The death toll climbed to 55 in just 48 hours. But the true terror was not the number itself, it was the realization among white Virginians that the framework of control could not hold against an unwavering mind. Fear spread faster than any militia could march. And in that fear was a lesson that history would try to bury. Obedience is never guaranteed. Authority is never absolute. And once a system is challenged by clarity and conviction, no amount of violence can restore it fully. When the rebellion finally collapsed under the weight of military retaliation, the narrative was rewritten, sanitized, and obscured. Nat Turner was captured, tried, and executed, but the system's revenge extended far beyond him. More than 100 people, most innocent, were killed in reprisals. Newspapers called it an incident. Textbooks reduced it to a footnote, and generations of Virginians grew up ignorant of the scale, the reasoning, and the philosophy behind the uprising. This was no accident. Erasure is a tool as powerful as any weapon. Those who control the story control perception, and perception, more than blood, is what maintains dominion. But the truth endures in subtle ways. Nat Turner's rebellion was not only a rebellion against physical chains, but against the mental architectures of power that allowed slavery to persist. He revealed that obedience is a contract contingent on belief, that fear can be subverted, and that one man's clarity can shake an entire society to its core. Every plantation, every courthouse, every institution that claimed permanence was exposed as fragile in the presence of purpose and conviction. Even today, the echoes remain. The rebellion is buried, sanitized, feared, yet the lessons endure. Control relies on submission. Fear is a tool, belief is a weapon, and when someone awakens fully, systems designed to suppress crumble faster than anyone anticipates. Nat Turner became more than a man, he became a symbol of what is possible when the oppressed stop asking for permission, when the enslaved claim consciousness as their own, and when belief is more powerful than law. The final lesson is chilling and clear. Power is never absolute. History bends to those who see clearly and act decisively. And for those willing to step into the shadows, to understand control, psychology, and the unspoken rules that govern obedience, there is knowledge that the powerful hope you will never possess. If you are watching this now, recognize the weight of what you have seen. Comment below twice, "I see the truth." By doing so, you acknowledge that understanding is no longer optional, that awareness changes the rules, and that once a man grasps the mechanics of power and fear, he can never return to ignorance. Nat Turner's story is more than history, it is a blueprint, a warning, and an awakening.